We were all robbed of an incredible opportunity when we were younger with physical education in school. It's unfortunate because through the body, we have an unimaginable amount of potential waiting to be explored. It's a genuine tragedy when such a huge aspect of who we are isn't given its proper standing in our life and goes completely unexplored for the majority of us. We can all think of the obvious benefits of physical activity when it comes to staying fit, strong, and capable of moving in our environment well into our later years. But we fail to recognize how it's linked to some of the more important existential issues we have as humans. Things like managing stress, understanding ourselves and our motivations, navigating difficult and challenging situations, finding our purpose in life, and actually leading a happy and fulfilling life. You may not be convinced that the body and physical activity have such a strong relationship with these aspects of being a human, but by the end of this video, I guarantee you'll have a totally new perspective of physical activity, the body, and what it means to be human. Now look, these are bold claims, I get it. You're probably wondering who I am to talk about these issues and what gives me the authority to speak on them. Let me tell you where I'm coming from. My experience with physical activity when I was younger was a far cry from what was being taught in physical education. We essentially played football and rounders and just cycled through them every 2 weeks. Not much of an education, but just a lazy attempt by my school to just say we did something with them. The thing is, this is the experience for the majority of people with physical education in school. I count myself lucky in the fact that PE wasn't my only exposure to physical activity. I was thrown into a broad range of different activities and sports when I was a kid. It was an area of life I really resonated with. From there, physical activity in the body became an incredible guide and teacher in my life. It provided me a lot of joy and happiness. It also provided lots of frustration and challenges to overcome. I began to see the body and physical activity as a vessel for change because of how much it was shaping my character and who I was as an individual. It provided a playground to practically learn who I was that I wasn't getting from anything else in school. It led me down the path of getting my bachelor's degree in sports science and health, and I've been working closely with people for a little over 10 years now as a teacher, coach, and guide when it comes to movement. All of this has been fueled by a desire to live a life of freedom. Freedom in body, mind, and spirit. This is the direction my work with my students has taken over the last few years because I've seen the power that physical activity or work on the body in general can have on people's lives. One of my students, Peter, was in so much pain that he thought this is just me now and he was going to have to give up his sports for good. After working on different aspects of the system I'm about to show you, Peter is in a completely different place with his understanding of the body and what he's capable of doing. He said it's hard to describe unless you feel the pain that I was in at the time. I've had multiple students like Peter completely change their outlook on life and go through similar life-changing experiences when it comes to movement, their body, and their understanding of what it means to move freely. What I'm going to show you is how I've achieved these kind of results with my students. I'm going to show you what physical education should have looked like in school. First, we need to reframe education and what it means so that we can use it as a way of gaining more agency or autonomy over our lives. Then we'll take a look at how we should be approaching physical activity and the different practices we can do to bring us towards the end goal of freedom of the body when it comes to movement. Then we'll look at how we can incorporate different practices to help us free our mind and what we're capable of. Finally, we'll tie things all together in terms of practices and strategies around spirituality that can help us become more well-rounded and connected within our society. Let's get started, shall we? Am I the only one who thought that they were going to be doing a lot more long division and algebra as an adult? It's kind of funny when you think back to school and the amount of useless information we were taught. I don't mean useless in the sense that the information itself is useless. Clearly maths has its utility in life. But what I'm really pointing to is the fact that we learn so many things that we don't really have any use for. Even the way in which we learn is pretty strange. We're just fed information with no real context and just expected to remember it. From primary school all the way up to third level education, we're being tested on our ability to just remember information and regurgitate it at one moment in time during an exam. This is not what education is supposed to be. When you look at what this has meant for how we navigate the world as humans, you can start to see how this approach to education and learning is flawed. We come out of the schooling system with almost no real life skills. We don't know how to problem solve. We don't know how to think for ourselves or how to research and find unbiased information. We don't know how to be creative in any way, which is a fundamental part of being human. Put all this together and you see how we struggle massively to make sense of the world. So much so that we struggle to find our place in the world. We lack passion and meaning. We search for short-term pleasures and rewards instead of striving towards things that give us long-term satisfaction and security. We've become somewhat docile and submissive to those with more power than us instead of learning to navigate the world with a sense of freedom, autonomy, and sovereignty. But what if I told you there was another way of approaching education? One that actually gives us an ability to learn what is necessary to thrive as a human, problem solve, and think critically and creatively. Well, these were some of the underlying principles behind the work of John Dewey. He was an American philosopher, psychologist, and educator from the late 1800s and early 1900s. His educational philosophy emphasized experiential learning, where education is grounded in real-world experiences and the active participation of students. He was a big critic of the education system at the time. He criticized things like passive learning, where memorization is the focus, the rigid standardization of the curriculum which ignored individual needs, abilities, and interests, the authoritarian relationship between students and teachers where no real discourse was allowed, the narrow focus on intellectual development while neglecting emotional, social, and physical growth, the poor preparation of students to participate meaningfully in a democratic society, the overemphasis on uniformity and conformity instead of independent thought and adaptability. Even though he criticized these things way back in the early 1900s, most of these elements are still at play today in the education system. Dewey was one of the leading thinkers behind the philosophical school of pragmatism, and more specifically what he referred to as instrumentalism. Philosophical discourse had taken a very abstract and linguistic focus at the time, whereas Dewey emphasized that knowledge and ideas should be evaluated based on their practical application and their ability to solve real-world problems. I'm going to list 3 very important principles of pragmatism that we're going to use as the basis of our approach to physical education and the body. Number 1 is the importance of lived experience in shaping thoughts and knowledge. This is an integral part of what it means to be a human in a body. We derive our knowledge and understanding from our lived experience through a process of action and reflection, which forms the basis of meaningful learning and growth. Number 2 is knowledge as a tool for action. Dewey believed that knowledge evolved through interaction with the environment. The value of an idea lies in its usefulness for solving problems we face in real life and improving human experience. Number 3 is experimental methods. Dewey thought philosophy should be grounded in experimentation and inquiry. He believed that hypotheses should be tested through action and observation, mirroring the process of scientific discovery. Before moving on to the next section, I just want to pause and take stock of the fact that we're now armed with very powerful, practical principles of education. We're no longer looking at education as a static and cold process that doesn't prepare us for living. We're now looking at education as a vibrant process, full of life, that has the potential to liberate us from the problems and issues we face as humans in the world. So where do we focus our attention with these 3 principles of pragmatic education? Well, let me introduce you to the curriculum. I've broken down the focus of my work with my students into something called the Connected Human Framework. I'd like to introduce each area of focus individually from more of a bird's eye view so you can see the whole landscape. Then I'm going to zoom in and show you some of the specific things I would typically do with my students when they start working with me as an introduction to this area. Let's first look at the main area of focus. This is an area you're going to be most familiar with when it comes to physical education, and that's simply put, physical activity. One of the things to recognize with most forms of physical activity is that they're very isolated. There's often a goal attached to the activity which shapes the direction of where it goes. Bodybuilders want to build bigger, more defined muscles. Weightlifters want to execute 2 very specific movements, the snatch and the clean and jerk, with as much weight as possible. Dancers want to move with a more aesthetic level of grace with the body. No matter the discipline, it has some form of objective for the body. The interesting thing that starts to happen over time is that the objective starts to shape the viewpoint of the body. An insulated and cocooned view of physical activity leads to certain things being hailed as useful and others being disregarded as useless. This happens to such an extent that beliefs start to form that other disciplines are harmful or actually useless in general, not just in the context of the activity. A closed-mindedness starts to develop as the discipline distances itself from other forms of activity. As a simple example, I've heard dancers comment on the fact that increasing their strength will make them tight and affect their dancing negatively. I've heard bodybuilders comment on how stretching is useless and it's not going to help them build muscle. The thing I'm pointing to here is that these disciplines all have their own goals and objectives for the body when it comes to physical activity. But what they fail to do is look at the body from a more integrated perspective. They fail to zoom back out. They only see the body in the context of their discipline and what it promotes. They become blind to how insular and closed-minded their perspective has become by outright rejecting some of the benefits a more holistic and well-rounded approach could bring. A lot of the issues we face when it comes to physical activity are often a direct result of the isolated, one-dimensional viewpoint of physical activity. We don't know how the body works. We don't know why it works the way it works. We don't know how to learn new movements with the body. We don't know how to address common issues we all come up against. We don't know how it affects other aspects of who we are as a human. Think about this for a second and what it means for an education system to not teach you about your own body and the practical issues you're going to come up against as a human living in the world. No wonder we're lost, distracted, and unfulfilled. We do not know ourselves. This is another great example of Dewey's criticism of the education system. We've learned a curriculum that hasn't prepared us for the problems we all inevitably face. We've learned subjects in isolation rather than an interdisciplinary approach where we see their practical real-world application. Think about how you're taught to learn a movement. Just copy the demonstration as best you can. No explanation of the how or why when it comes to the movement itself or the body as a structure. We've learned one setting, one application. But there is an alternative. If we can train ourselves to zoom out, then we start to look at the value each discipline holds in its teachings and how they can relate to a broader objective of freeing the body. The idea here is that all of these disciplines and fields of movements have some inherent value, something to offer. With the approach of integrating these teachings, we now have a framework that relates more to the human being as a whole and the development of a more robust and capable body. We can be strong, flexible, powerful, graceful, athletic, soft, dexterous, and more with the right approach. Why have one thing when you can have it all? Not only that, but armed with the 3 principles of pragmatic education, we can learn how to navigate the many issues that arise in life as a result of being in a body. The best way of encapsulating the bird's eye view of physical activity in my connected human framework and giving it an overall objective is freedom of movement. We want to cover a broad curriculum of practices that allow us to free the body of its constraints. With this broad view, we can start to investigate and pull different disciplines together to form our own unique practice. If this is the overall aim, then what does it mean for my new students coming into my work? In the early stages, it's important to look at some of the fundamental capacities of the body while also exploring more creative and open forms of movement. By fundamental capacities, I mean things like strength, flexibility, endurance, coordination, all of the things that we can isolate and build on their own. We can look at certain capacities for a period of time and cycle through them at various stages to give them adequate time to develop. Remember, we do this with a more integrative approach, so we can also look at more broad systems of movement that have a more task-oriented objective. Things like locomotion, object manipulation, jumping and landing. We can also look at movement as a more creative outlet, which is one of the more sophisticated and worthwhile objectives with movement. Creative expression of any form can give us a tremendous sense of purpose and value in life. When you learn to do that through the body and movement, it's a very powerful human experience. These are all elements that can be worked on right in the early stages of developing a movement practice. You can imagine that this is a process that naturally unfolds over time as we start to build our capabilities and movement vocabulary. With all of that being said around movement and physical activity, it's important to zoom back out for a moment. If you've watched my previous videos on reframing physical activity, then you know we've only looked at one layer of what it means to be human. We have another equally valid area of self-development that we can apply the same principles of pragmatic education to. Let's take a look at freeing the mind. Based on some of the principles of pragmatism set out by Dewey, it would be foolish not to approach the mind in the same way we approach physical activity and the body. The key thing is seeing the interconnectedness here. We want to integrate the mind into our curriculum because of the vital role it plays as a human. If anything, the fact that we can develop the body in very specific ways hints at the idea that the mind is equally malleable and capable of change. It's unfortunate that our education system hasn't really made us aware of this possibility. We've become fixed in our thinking that intelligence and intellect are the most important characteristics of the mind, and they're the only thing worth developing through education. This leads to so many of our other mental faculties like imagination, intuition, and perception going undeveloped and unappreciated. Once again, think about what it means to have a mind and for the education system you've been brought up in to not give you any practical understanding of how it works, how it can be fooled, how it can work against you, and most importantly, how you can change it and optimize its function for a happy and healthy life filled with purpose. We're not equipped at all to look after ourselves and be autonomous individuals in society. We've been placed on the battlefield of life with a cardboard cutout of a sword and shield. There is, of course, a solution to all of this. If we shift our approach towards pragmatic education, we can learn practical tools and ways of shaping our minds for the better. We can look at the inner workings of our mind and peel back the layers to start uncovering a more authentic and true version of self. Within my Connected Human framework, we go through a curriculum of practices related to the mind. We look towards fields like psychology, philosophy, and neuroscience to give us a focal point of discourse, and then we can make sure we look at its practical impact on our lives through things like journaling, meditation, contemplation, and experimentation. Similar to how we looked at the various disciplines of physical activity for the body, we want to cover a broad curriculum of practices for the mind so we're more well-rounded. It's not a case of just adding more and more practices to your routine. We need time to act in the world, of course. It's more about playing with different practices at various stages and cycling in and out of them. With the overall objective being to free the mind, one practice in particular acts as a great introduction for new students working with me. We use meditation as a way of building conscious awareness. When I think of conscious awareness, I think of one very specific quote from Carl Jung. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Consciousness or awareness is the first step in the process of uncovering the mind. If you aren't aware of something you are doing, how are you going to change it? The idea is that we need to uncover things about ourselves. So we need to understand ourselves at our very root. In order to do this, we need to look inward. The challenge we face is that we are highly adapted as humans to the external environment. It's hard to understand ourselves with the onslaught of inputs from our senses. This sensory data helps us map the outside world, but how do we map the internal environment? Who we are as an individual is not our senses or the data we receive from our senses. We cannot stop our body from receiving sensory input, but we can train ourselves to not be distracted by them. Only when we are not distracted by our senses can we fully observe the mind and its inner workings. This is how we learn to understand ourselves. Building a consistent habit with meditation is the first step we want to take in our journey with freeing the mind. I think it's important to point back towards Dewey's idea of experience being so important in our education. So much of how we educate ourselves is by gathering information. If we do that for the mind, then we'll just end up with useless information about what it means to be less anxious, stressed, angry, or depressed, but we won't actually be doing anything about it. Practices like meditation and others will mean we're actually doing things to bring us towards these more preferred states instead of just knowing they exist. Now, with all of this in mind, you're probably noticing a crossover between practices of the body and practices of the mind. You'd be right in thinking that. What we do with the body affects the mind. What we do with the mind affects the body. But there is a third and equally relevant layer of self we want to dedicate time to developing. This third layer of the connected human framework is freeing the soul. If this aspect of the work sounds somewhat strange to you, I can understand. It can be the hardest to grasp and comprehend because much of this layer exists outside of us. One of the easiest ways to understand this is that you've probably heard that humans are hardwired to be social creatures. We exist within a society, a culture, a community, a family, and we have relationships with other humans. This also extends further in the sense that we are connected to everything. We're just more aware of our strong ties to other humans. So while there may be benefits to understanding yourself as an individual, it would be incorrect to view ourselves as completely separate and not connected to the universe. I heard a very interesting observation of the brain and how it evolved from the neuroscientist Rick Hansen. He was talking about 3 specific evolutionary strategies the brain uses for animals like us to pass on our genes. These goals are fundamental to our existence as a biological organism, and without them, we would not survive. 2 of them aren't relevant to our discussion, but the one that is relevant is the nervous system strategy to create a border between itself and the outside world. It's a necessary process so that you as a biological organism can self-regulate and operate within the environment. Your brain needs to know what's in your control and what's outside of your control in order to survive. But what this cuts us off from is how connected the universe actually is. You have to stretch your mind a little bit, but consider what it means to live in the universe, and the only thing that separates you from the environment is your subjective experience of reality as a result of a survival mechanism. A great way to think of these issues is lifting the veil of experience in order to see things in a different way. When you sit with this for a while and attempt to see through this alternative lens, you can start to see the web of connections between everything in the universe. Alan Watts, the famous spiritual teacher, summed this up pretty nicely in one of his lectures where he was talking about how everything is interconnected and inseparable. And I'm quoting here, because sometimes when I'm in the middle of all this, I feel as if I were in the middle of an amazing brain. In other words, the brain is a network of interconnected neurons, and each one of those neurons is a fairly simple affair. Because it either fires or it doesn't fire, it gives you the message on or off, or yes or no. But what we call things, plants, birds, trees, are far more complicated than neurons, and there are billions of them, and they are all living together in a network. Just as there is an interdependence of flowers and bees, where there are no flowers, there are no bees, and where there are no bees, there are no flowers. They're really one organism. In the same way, everything in nature depends on everything else, so it's interconnected. And so the very, very many patterns of interconnections lock it all together into a unity, which is much too complicated for us to think about, except in very simple, crude ways. But I am a part of this. I am, as it were, one of the cells in this tremendous brain, which I can't understand because the part cannot comprehend the whole. And yet, at the same time, I don't feel like so many people seem to feel, that I'm a foreigner or a stranger in this world. Its aesthetic forms somehow appeal to me more than most of the atheistic forms which men produce. I feel in it as if, in the same way that you see a flower in the field, it's really the whole field that is flowering, because the flower couldn't exist in that particular place without the special surroundings of the field that it has. You only find flowers in surroundings which will support them. You only find human beings on a planet of this kind, with atmosphere of this kind, with temperature of this kind supplied by a convenient neighboring star. And so just as the flower is flowering in the field, I feel myself as a personing, manning, peopling of the whole universe. In other words, I seem, like everything else, to be a center, a sort of vortex at which the whole energy of the universe realizes itself, comes alive, a sort of aperture through which the whole universe is conscious of itself. The essential point is obvious, that each one of us, not only human beings, but every leaf, every weed, exists in the way it does, only because everything else around it does. The individual and the universe are inseparable, but the curious thing is that while that is rather easy to see in theory, very few people are aware of it in the important, strong way that one is aware of the blue in blue sky or the heat in fire. It's more of an idea than it is of a realization. Now, with a quote like that, there is something being pointed to, and there's a whole lot we can learn from them. Once again, the criticisms John Dewey made of the education system can partially explain our lack of knowledge in this area. There is a rigid syllabus that is largely shaped by the ideology of the culture you live in. You're exposed to these ideas and indoctrinated by them from such a young age that you forget to question them or whether alternative ideas exist outside of the bubble of your culture. The ideas, stories, beliefs, and traditions of other cultures are no less valid than the one you were brought up in. But they may offer us another vantage point of viewing something we see as fundamental to our reality. This alternative way of looking at something can shake the foundations of who we are and our place in the world. They can take us out of our rigid and narrow way of looking at the world and our place in it. My objective here with this aspect of the work I do with my students is to present material from some of the various traditions that were concerned with the esoteric and spiritual aspect of life. An important thing to note is that we are not looking to adopt them blindly. A comprehensive and robust assessment of these traditions is what's needed in my eyes to see both the positive and negative aspects of their doctrine. Only then can we put ourselves in a good position to extract the wisdom inherent in their teachings while also avoiding dogmatic, zealous, and narrow-minded thinking. Once again, a blend of theory and practical exercises are used to help us experiment and play with some of these ideas. I like to start with the work of Gurdjieff and Uspensky with my students because there's a nice blend of psychology and spirituality that gives us a much more accessible entry point into this kind of work. Their work also mirrors Dewey's in that there are lots of practical exercises and things they point to help us bring awareness to our actions. Now that we've looked at each of the three main pillars of the connected human framework, let's take a bird's eye view again. You can see on this diagram how each layer is not entirely independent, but they all cross over in some way. Like we've discussed previously, our body affects our mind and the way we think. Our mind and the way we think affects our body. With everything we've discussed in this video, we've gone through a pretty comprehensive look at the potential physical activity holds when we approach education through a practical lens. I've found this work immensely transformative, and so have my students. If you're looking to find out the exact details of what I do with my students and how you can go through this process of change, then I'd highly advise you check what I've linked in the description of this video. It's an open invitation for anyone who wants to become a student of mine and work on freeing the body by developing a movement practice. I want my approach and my framework to be understood and useful to people regardless of whether they decide to work with me directly. It's the main reason why I make a lot of this material free. But until this work is practically applied, it's going to do nothing for you. If you're interested in getting started with this work, then have a full look at the invite that I've linked in the description. From there, it's entirely up to you if this looks like the exact thing you need and you want to start working together. I appreciate your time and hope you've been enjoying these more long form videos I've been doing recently. I've found tremendous value in being able to expand on topics and ideas, so thank you for being a part of my world and allowing me to develop myself through my writing. Be sure to like the video, share it if you want, subscribe to the page, do all those things. Thanks folks, I'll see you soon.